There are moments in history when humanity begins to believe it no longer needs limits. Moments when success becomes confidence, confidence becomes pride, and pride quietly transforms into something far more dangerous. The belief that human beings no longer need to look upward, because perhaps they themselves can become gods. Long before the rise of Egypt, before Babylon stood crowned in glory, before Rome dreamed of empire, there was a man whose name survived only in fragments. A shadow, hidden between ancient lines, a ruler wrapped in mystery, a hunter, a king, perhaps even a tyrant. His name was Nimrod. And though history remembers conquerors by armies and emperors by monuments, Nimrod is remembered for something stranger, an idea, a dream so ambitious that it dared challenge heaven itself. Imagine a world freshly scarred by catastrophe. Humanity had survived destruction. The floodwaters had vanished. Civilization stood trembling at the edge of a new beginning. People feared chaos, feared separation, feared becoming weak again. And in moments like these, history often searches for strong men. Men who promise order, protection, greatness, unity. And somewhere in this wounded world, one man began to rise. The scriptures describe him with unusual language, a mighty hunter before the Lord. At first glance, it sounds noble, heroic even. A warrior, a provider, a survivor. But ancient scholars have argued for centuries about what those words truly mean. Was Nimrod hunting animals? Or was he hunting power? Was he humanity's protector? Or its first great manipulator? Because according to ancient tradition, Nimrod did not simply rule. He built. Cities rose beneath his vision. Walls climbed toward the sky. Civilization gathered around his authority. For the first time since the flood, humanity was becoming united again. One people, one language, one purpose. And at first, that sounds beautiful, does not it? No war, no division, no chaos. Civilization finally learning how to stand together. But history has taught us something terrifying. Sometimes the most dangerous moments are not when societies collapse, but when they become powerful enough to believe nothing can stop them. Because unity without humility can become control. Strength without wisdom can become domination. And ambition. Ambition without restraint can become obsession. Then came the idea. Simple, brilliant, terrifying. A city unlike any before. A tower unlike any ever imagined. Something so massive, so impossible, that it would rise into the heavens themselves. Not merely a building, a statement, a declaration to the universe. We will make a name for ourselves. No more dependence, no more fear, no more vulnerability. Humanity would stand united. Humanity would rise. Humanity would never again be scattered. But hidden beneath this dream lurked a question humanity still struggles to answer today. At what point does progress become pride? At what point does greatness become rebellion? And perhaps even more uncomfortable, what if the greatest danger to civilization is not weakness, but success? Because the story of Nimrod is not simply about a tower. It is about human ambition, the hunger to rise higher, build bigger, control more, reach further, and silence the terrifying feeling of human fragility. The same hunger that built empires, the same hunger that sparked wars, the same hunger that now pushes humanity toward artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, digital immortality, and dreams of becoming something greater than human itself. Thousands of years later, we still build towers. Only now, they are made of steel. Algorithms, money, influence, power. We tell ourselves, We are advancing. We are evolving. We are unstoppable. But history whispers a warning, because every civilization that believed it could rise forever eventually faced the same question. What happens when humans begin reaching too high? Was Nimrod a villain, a dictator obsessed with control? Or was he something far more complicated? A visionary leader trying to protect humanity from chaos? A man who believed unity could save civilization? A dreamer whose ambitions simply grew too large? Because history has a strange habit of turning heroes into tyrants, and tyrants into misunderstood visionaries. And somewhere between myth and memory, between history and warning, Nimrod still stands, watching, waiting. As humanity repeats the same dangerous temptation, build higher, grow stronger, become greater, and perhaps become untouchable. But every tower casts a shadow, and every dream, no matter how glorious, eventually asks for a price. Because what happened next would fracture humanity forever. Languages would divide, civilizations would scatter, and one man's dream of unity would become one of history's greatest mysteries. Tonight, we uncover the forgotten story of the man who dared build toward heaven, the hunter, the ruler, the architect of Babel, the man history almost erased, Nimrod. And before this story ends, you may begin to wonder whether the Tower of Babel was never truly destroyed. Because perhaps humanity never stopped building it. The world after destruction is never quiet. Not truly. Even when the storms disappear, even when the waters retreat, even when the sky clears and sunlight touches the earth once more, something remains: memory, fear, the unbearable silence left behind by catastrophe. Imagine standing in a world that has forgotten its own history. No cities, no kingdoms, no roads cutting through mountains, no crowded marketplaces, no towers reaching upward in arrogant confidence, only ruins swallowed by mud, broken landscapes, a wounded earth still carrying the scars of judgment. And somewhere beneath an endless sky, humanity begins again. Not millions, not nations, only a single family. Survivors, people who had watched an entire civilization disappear beneath rising waters. People who had heard screams swallowed by storms. People who had lost neighbors, memories, generations. People forced to carry the unbearable burden of being alive when so many others were not. This is where the story of Nimrod truly begins. Not with power, not with ambition, but with trauma, because civilizations are often shaped by the fears they inherit. And humanity after the flood inherited one fear above all others. Never again. Never again chaos. Never again vulnerability. Never again helplessness. Never again destruction. The flood had done something terrifying to the human imagination. It had taught humanity how fragile survival truly was. And fragile people often become desperate for certainty, for protection, for order. This is why the world after the flood matters so deeply. Because before humanity ever dreamed of Babel, before Nimrod rose to power, the survivors faced a terrifying question. How do you rebuild life after the world ends? The scriptures describe Noah stepping out onto dry land beneath a transformed sky. Imagine that moment. No cities waiting, no civilization to return to, no familiar landmarks. The old world was gone. Everything humanity once trusted had vanished. And yet, life demanded continuation. Food still had to be found. Shelter still had to be built. Children still had to grow. The future, however uncertain, still needed shaping. And this is perhaps one of the most human truths hidden inside the ancient story. Even after devastation, people continue. After war, after grief, after heartbreak, after collapse, humanity somehow finds the strength to begin again. And so they rebuilt. Slowly, painfully. Families multiplied. Children became tribes. Tribes became communities. Communities became settlements. And somewhere within this fragile rebuilding process, a dangerous tension quietly emerged. Freedom versus fear. Because survival changes people when humans experience catastrophe. They often move in one of two directions. Some become humble, more compassionate, more aware of fragility. But others become obsessed with control, because once you understand how easily life can disappear, you begin craving systems that feel permanent, structures that feel safe, power that feels secure. Humanity after the flood carried both instincts, hope and fear. The descendants of Noah spread outward into unfamiliar lands. The world still felt enormous, wild, unpredictable. Forests stretched endlessly. Mountains towered untouched. Rivers carved through dangerous terrain. Storms still frightened people. Nature still felt bigger than human survival. And somewhere deep inside collective memory remained the haunting knowledge. The world can end. We have seen it. We have survived it. But what if it happens again? Fear has always shaped civilization. More than intelligence. More than ambition. Fear. Fear builds walls. Fear creates governments. Fear strengthens armies. Fear convinces people to surrender freedom for protection. And perhaps nowhere was this more true than in the generations after the flood. Because scattered humanity faced a difficult reality. Isolation was dangerous. Small groups could disappear. Families alone could starve. Tribes divided could become weak. And so the ancient survivors slowly learned something powerful. Unity increases survival. Together, people could defend themselves. Together, people could farm. Together, people could build. Together, people could fight against uncertainty. This instinct was not evil. In many ways, it was wisdom, because civilization itself begins with cooperation. The first villages were acts of trust. The first cities were promises. The first governments were attempts to create stability in an unstable world. And yet, hidden inside every human attempt to create order, there exists temptation. Because once people gather together, someone eventually rises. Someone stronger, someone smarter, someone charismatic, someone capable of speaking confidence into frightened hearts. History repeats this pattern endlessly. After collapse, strong leaders emerge. After uncertainty, voices of certainty become irresistible. After fear, power feels comforting. Humanity longs for someone to say, "Follow me. You know the way forward." And somewhere inside this rebuilding world, a new generation was growing. A generation that had not witnessed the flood firsthand. This matters, because memory weakens over time. The grandchildren of survivors rarely fear what terrified their ancestors. The old warnings begin sounding exaggerated. The old grief begins fading into story. The old disasters begin feeling distant. Children born after catastrophe often inherit the benefits of survival, without inheriting its caution. And this is where civilizations become vulnerable. Because prosperity breeds confidence. Confidence breeds pride. And pride quietly forgets history. The flood became memory. Memory became myth. Myth became distance. And slowly, humanity began believing itself strong again. Fields grew abundant. Trade expanded. Knowledge spread. Tools improved. Families multiplied faster than ever before. And for the first time since destruction, humanity began dreaming not merely of survival, but greatness. This is the turning point hidden beneath the surface of the story. Because surviving catastrophe changes what people value. The survivors had valued safety, but the next generation? The next generation wanted significance. A name, a future, a civilization that would never vanish. And perhaps this desire feels familiar. Because modern humanity behaves much the same way. We build because we fear loss. We innovate because we fear weakness. We gather information because uncertainty terrifies us. We construct systems because chaos feels unbearable. Or tallest buildings, or greatest technologies, or obsession with legacy. These are not merely signs of intelligence. Sometimes they are signs of fear. Fear disguised as progress. And yet humanity after the flood had another problem. Scattering. The world was vast. Resources were uneven. Different families moved in different directions. Languages had not yet divided, but geography already threatened unity. Distance creates difference. Difference creates misunderstanding. Misunderstanding creates conflict. And for a species still haunted by catastrophe, division felt dangerous. The people feared being scattered. Alone again, weak again, vulnerable again. Imagine standing in that ancient world. No maps, no nations, no stable future, only uncertainty stretching endlessly across unfamiliar land. Would you not also desire unity? Would you not want protection? Would you not long for something permanent? A city, perhaps. A center. A place strong enough to survive anything. A civilization, powerful enough that no flood, no chaos, no uncertainty could ever threaten it again. This desire, though understandable, contained danger. Because human beings rarely stop at enough. Security becomes ambition. Ambition becomes dominance. Dominance becomes pride. And pride has always whispered the same seductive promise. You no longer need limits. You no longer need dependence. You no longer need humility. You can protect yourself, save yourself, elevate yourself, build something so great that even heaven must notice. Somewhere inside humanity's collective imagination, a dream began forming, a city unlike any before, a civilization so united, so strong, so unforgettable, that history itself would never erase them. No more wandering, no more fear, no more vulnerability, no more dependence upon forces beyond human control. The people said something deeply revealing. Let us make a name for ourselves. At first glance, the sentence sounds harmless, even admirable. What is wrong with legacy? What is wrong with wanting meaning? What is wrong with building something lasting? But hidden beneath those words lies one of humanity's oldest wounds, the fear of insignificance, the terror of being forgotten. Humans do not simply fear death, we fear disappearing, being erased, meaning nothing. And perhaps this explains more of civilization than we realize. Why do kings build monuments? Why do billionaires seek immortality through innovation? Why do leaders hunger for influence? Why do nations race for dominance? Because somewhere beneath all human striving lies the same desperate longing. Remember us. See us? Do not let us vanish. The people after the flood feared scattering, but perhaps what they feared even more was meaninglessness. And history was about to give them a leader bold enough to transform fear into vision. A man unlike the cautious survivors before him. A man who did not merely want safety. He wanted greatness. A hunter, a ruler, a builder, a name remembered long after empires fell. Nimrod. But before humanity raised stones toward heaven, before Babel cast its shadow across history, something deeper had already begun rising. An idea, dangerous, beautiful, terrifying. The belief that humanity united together could finally become unstoppable. And history has always trembled. Whenever humans begin believing that, there are people in history whose names echo across centuries. Kings who built empires, warriors who conquered nations, prophets who reshaped civilizations. And then, there are figures who stand in the shadows, half remembered, half forgotten. People history seems unable to explain. Names surrounded by mystery, fragments, whispers, questions. Nimrod belongs to this second category. His story is strange, disturbingly short, almost suspiciously brief. For a man supposedly powerful enough to shape the destiny of civilization, the Bible says remarkably little about him. Only a handful of lines, a few ancient descriptions, and yet somehow, his shadow stretches across one of the most important moments in biblical memory. Because Nimrod was not remembered for what he said. He was remembered for what he built, and perhaps more dangerously, for what humanity became under his vision. The text introduces him with unusual language. Cush fathered Nimrod. He was the first on earth to be a mighty man. Pause there for a moment. The first mighty man. Why phrase it this way? Surely strong people had existed before. Surely hunters had survived harsh landscapes long before Nimrod. Adam worked the earth. Cain built cities. Noah survived catastrophe. So what made Nimrod different? What exactly did ancient people mean when they called someone mighty? In our modern world, power often means wealth, influence, technology, military force. But in the ancient imagination, might meant something primal. The ability to shape reality, the ability to command, to protect, to dominate, to gather frightened people beneath a vision larger than themselves. Nimrod was not merely strong. He was influential, the kind of person people followed, the kind of person history naturally bends around. And history has always loved such men, because uncertain societies hunger for certainty. Broken civilizations crave strong voices. Fear creates opportunity, especially for ambitious leaders. Imagine the world Nimrod inherited. Humanity was rebuilding from trauma. The flood remained a haunting memory. Civilization existed only in fragments. No great empires yet ruled. No stable political systems had emerged. The world felt fragile, dangerous, unfinished, and in unfinished worlds, people naturally search for order. This is where figures like Nimrod rise, not by accident, not randomly, but because human fear creates openings for power. A hunter, that is how Scripture first describes him, a mighty hunter before the Lord. At first, the phrase sounds noble, heroic, perhaps even admirable. We imagine a rugged survivor moving through dangerous wilderness, a protector feeding villages, a skilled warrior defending fragile communities against wild threats. And maybe part of that image is true, because in ancient societies, hunters mattered. Survival depended on courage, skill, strength. To hunt successfully meant understanding danger better than others. It meant patience, leadership, precision. Hunters were providers, protectors, symbols of competence in an unpredictable world. A great hunter naturally becomes respected. Respected people become trusted. Trusted people become leaders. And leaders eventually gain power. But ancient interpreters noticed something unsettling about Nimrod's title. The phrase "before the Lord" could carry another meaning, not merely in God's presence, but in defiance, in opposition, almost as though Nimrod's greatness stood face to face against divine authority itself. This changes everything. Suddenly, the hunter becomes more complicated. What exactly was Nimrod hunting? Animals, or influence, safety, or domination? Some Jewish traditions went even further. They claimed Nimrod hunted men, not literally with weapons, but politically, psychologically, drawing people into systems of loyalty, persuading humanity to trust human power more than divine wisdom. Whether historically true or not, The symbolism feels hauntingly familiar, because history has produced many Nimrods, leaders who emerge after crisis, leaders promising unity, leaders offering greatness, leaders saying, "Together, we will never suffer again. Together, we will become strong. Together, we will build something permanent." And frightened people listen, because certainty feels comforting, especially after chaos. The scriptures continue. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, a kingdom. Notice that word. This matters, because Nimrod may represent one of the first empire builders in biblical memory. Not merely a tribal leader, not merely a village protector, a ruler, someone imagining something larger. Cities connected, power centralized, humanity organized beneath one authority. This was revolutionary. Before kingdoms came tribes, families, loose communities. But kingdoms change the human story. Kingdoms create laws, armies, taxes, hierarchy, identity, protection. But kingdoms also create concentration of power, and concentrated power always carries temptation. Because once people obey, the ruler begins believing himself necessary. Once influence grows, ambition rarely remains satisfied. History repeats this pattern endlessly. Alexander, Caesar, Napoleon, modern political strongmen, power almost never says, "Enough." Instead, power whispers, more land, more control, more influence, more greatness, more legacy. And perhaps Nimrod was humanity's first great experiment in centralized civilization. Imagine standing in that ancient world, scattered communities struggling to survive, fear everywhere, uncertainty everywhere. Then suddenly, a man rises, confident, capable, fearless. A builder, a visionary, someone speaking boldly about the future, someone saying, "We no longer need chaos. We no longer need weakness. We can become something greater." Would people follow him? Of course they would. Humans always follow confidence, especially when fear is fresh, especially when uncertainty feels unbearable. Perhaps this is why Nimrod fascinates scholars, because depending on how you read him, he becomes either hero or warning. One interpretation sees Nimrod positively, a civilization builder, a leader helping humanity recover, a protector creating order from chaos. After all, without strong leaders, civilization struggles to emerge. Cities do not build themselves. Infrastructure does not magically appear. Communities require organization. Vision matters. Ambition matters. Someone must imagine a future larger than fear. Maybe Nimrod simply did what humanity needed. Maybe he saw scattered survivors and thought, "We need unity. We need strength. We need civilization." And maybe, at first, he was right. But history warns us about another possibility. Visionaries sometimes become tyrants, not because they begin evil, but because success intoxicates. A leader admired too long begins believing himself exceptional, necessary, untouchable. A civilization grateful for order slowly becomes dependent. Questions disappear. Power expands. And eventually, the line between protector and ruler begins to blur. Perhaps Nimrod genuinely wanted safety, but safety without humility becomes control. Strength without limits becomes domination. Leadership without accountability becomes empire. This is why Nimrod feels strangely modern, because humanity still wrestles with the same tension. We admire powerful leaders. We crave certainty. We celebrate innovation. We reward ambition. But we also fear concentration of power. We fear the moment greatness turns dangerous, the moment confidence becomes arrogance, the moment vision becomes obsession. And hidden inside Nimrod's story lies a disturbing psychological truth. Humans love strong leaders, until strength begins replacing freedom. The scriptures say Nimrod's kingdom spread into places later associated with powerful empires: Babel, Erech, Akkad, Shinar. Names heavy with historical echoes. Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, the birthplace of cities. Law, agriculture, power structures, writing itself. Even if the historical details remain debated, the symbolism is powerful. Nimrod stands at the beginning of empire, the moment humanity shifts from surviving to ruling, from wandering to building, from vulnerability to ambition. And ambition changes people, because building something lasting feels intoxicating. Imagine watching cities rise beneath your authority, people speaking your name with admiration, structures surviving storms, communities growing because of your vision. Would you not begin believing in your own greatness? Would you not slowly start thinking, perhaps I was chosen for this? Perhaps I understand better than others. Perhaps humanity needs me. Power reshapes identity, and this may explain Babel better than anything else. Because towers are rarely just towers. Monuments are rarely just monuments. Architecture often reveals psychology. What humanity builds reveals what humanity worships. And somewhere beneath Nimrod's growing influence, an idea was forming. Not merely survival, not merely protection, something bigger. Something grander, a city united forever, a civilization impossible to destroy, a structure reaching upward, higher than anything humanity had ever dared imagine. A statement carved into the sky itself. No more fear, no more weakness, no more dependence. Humanity would stand united. Humanity would make a name for itself. Humanity would never again be scattered. But history has always feared leaders who begin believing limits no longer apply. Because every empire starts with a dream, and every dangerous dream begins with a question. What if we are capable of more? The question itself is not evil. It built medicine, art, science, civilization. But unchecked ambition always risks something darker. The desire not merely to grow, but to transcend, to rise above human limits, to replace dependence with control, to build so high that heaven itself becomes unnecessary. Perhaps Nimrod looked at humanity and saw weakness, fear, fragility, and perhaps he genuinely believed he could save them. A united people, one language, one purpose, one vision. No more wandering, no more vulnerability. Only greatness. But history has taught us something terrifying. Sometimes the most dangerous leaders are not the cruelest ones. Sometimes they are the ones who truly believe they are building paradise. Because paradise built by human pride has a strange habit of collapsing. And somewhere inside growing civilization, beneath ambition, beneath hope, beneath fear disguised as progress, the first stones of Babel were already waiting. The dream had begun, and soon, humanity would attempt something never before imagined. Not merely surviving the world, not merely ruling the earth, but reaching heaven itself. There are dreams that inspire humanity, dreams that heal nations, dreams that bring order to chaos. Dreams so powerful that people willingly sacrifice comfort, safety, even freedom to make them real. But history has taught us something unsettling. Sometimes the dreams that unite humanity are the same dreams that eventually break it. The story of Babel begins with a sentence so simple that it almost sounds harmless. Now, the whole world had one language and a common speech. At first glance, this sounds beautiful. No misunderstanding, no division, no war born from mistranslation, no fractured tribes suspicious of one another. Imagine it. One people, one language, one vision, humanity speaking as one voice. To modern ears, it almost sounds like paradise. Unity, cooperation, shared identity, a civilization finally overcoming fear and fragmentation. After generations of rebuilding, after surviving catastrophe, perhaps this was exactly what humanity needed. So it seemed, because beneath every beautiful dream hides a question. What exactly are people uniting around? Unity itself is not virtue. History proves this. People can unite around justice, compassion, truth. But people can also unite around fear, control, violence, pride. The crowd itself is never automatically righteous. Sometimes the crowd becomes dangerous precisely because everyone agrees. And somewhere inside this ancient united world, an idea began spreading. Not gradually, not quietly, but with contagious excitement. The kind of idea that feels too important to resist. The kind of dream that makes people believe they are participating in history itself. The scriptures say, as people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. Shinar, a fertile place, open land, possibility stretching across the horizon. Civilizations often begin in places like this, where geography invites ambition, where rivers promise agriculture, where survival becomes easier. And once survival becomes easier, humans begin dreaming bigger. Because hunger limits imagination, fear narrows vision, but prosperity changes the mind. The moment people feel safe, they begin asking larger questions. How can we grow? How can we become stronger? How can we ensure this never ends? The people of Shinar had inherited trauma. The flood remained a shadow hanging over collective memory. Scattering felt dangerous. Weakness felt terrifying. Isolation felt like vulnerability. And so they reached a conclusion that felt completely reasonable. Stay together. Build together. Protect one another. Never again become scattered and powerless. And perhaps, at first, this instinct was wise. Communities matter. Civilization matters. People survive better together. But then something shifted. The language changes. The dream evolves. Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. At first, this detail feels strangely unimportant. Why mention bricks? Why mention engineering? But ancient audiences would have understood immediately. This mattered because bricks symbolize technology, innovation, human capability. The ability to shape the environment rather than simply survive inside it. Stone had limitations. Nature imposed boundaries. But bricks meant humanity no longer depended entirely upon what the earth naturally offered. Humans could create, design, control, build upward. Civilization was becoming sophisticated, and sophistication breeds confidence. Confidence becomes belief. Belief becomes ambition. Soon the people say something revealing. Come, let us build ourselves a city. A city. Not merely houses, not villages. Something permanent, structured, powerful, a center of identity. This mattered deeply. Ancient people feared instability. Nomadic life felt uncertain. Wilderness felt dangerous. Cities represented safety, protection, legacy, a place where civilization could root itself against chaos. And again, at first glance, what sounds wrong about this? Nothing. Cities build culture, learning, art, trade, connection. Cities can represent human flourishing. But then comes the second half of the dream. The sentence that transforms ambition into something more dangerous, with a tower that reaches to the heavens. Now the story changes, because towers are never just towers, especially in the ancient world. Height symbolized power, authority, divinity. Kings built upward because elevation represented greatness. Temples stretched toward the sky because humans believed higher places connected heaven and earth. To build upward was to announce significance, to rise above limitation. And Babel wanted to rise higher than anyone before. Not merely survive, not merely flourish, reach heaven. Pause for a moment. What exactly did that mean? Did they literally believe they could climb into the sky? Probably not. The deeper symbolism matters more. The tower represented transcendence. Humanity reaching beyond human limitation. Humanity refusing weakness. Humanity creating something so extraordinary that even heaven would acknowledge them. Perhaps this feels surprisingly modern because humanity still builds towers, skyscrapers, global corporations, artificial intelligence, space exploration, technologies promising mastery over suffering itself. Every age creates Babel in its own image. Every generation whispers, "We are finally becoming powerful enough. We are finally escaping weakness. We are finally mastering reality." But beneath Babel lived something deeper than ambition, fear. The scriptures reveal it plainly, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth. There it is. Fear disguised as greatness. Humanity did not merely want achievement. Humanity feared insignificance. Scattering terrified them. Obscurity terrified them. Weakness terrified them. And perhaps this explains more about civilization than we realize. Humans crave permanence. We fear disappearing. We fear being forgotten. Why do rulers carve statues into stone? Why do companies chase global dominance? Why do influencers obsess over visibility? Why do people desperately protect reputation? Because somewhere deep down, humans long for a name. Recognition, meaning, legacy. The Babel builders simply made the longing visible. Let us make a name for ourselves. Such a human sentence. Beautiful, tragic, dangerous. Not. Let us honor truth. Not. Let us seek wisdom. Not. Let us care for one another. A name. Identity through greatness. Immortality through achievement. The hope that success might silence vulnerability. And history has always been haunted by this same temptation. Alexander conquered nations seeking legacy. Emperors built monuments hoping memory would outlive death. Modern billionaires dream of immortality through innovation. Politicians seek influence lasting beyond lifetimes. Ordinary people curate identities online, hoping invisibility never touches them. Humanity still fears scattering. We still fear insignificance. We still want names that survive us. Babel simply exposed the longing. But there was another problem hidden beneath the dream. The people wanted unity, without dependence, security, without humility, power, without accountability. Notice something strange. The flood had taught humanity fragility. It should have taught humility. Yet instead, humanity became more determined to eliminate vulnerability altogether. This is what trauma sometimes does. Pain can make people wiser, or pain can make people obsessed with control. The builders of Babel no longer wanted dependence upon uncertainty, no dependence upon nature, no dependence upon divine mercy, no dependence upon vulnerability. Instead, they would build something untouchable, permanent, invincible. A civilization strong enough to withstand anything. And somewhere in the center of this growing dream, perhaps stood Nimrod, watching, guiding, leading, the visionary ruler of a united people. Imagine him speaking before the crowds. Imagine his charisma, his confidence, the excitement he inspired. People do not build impossible things unless someone convinces them impossibility can be defeated. Perhaps Nimrod said, "We are stronger together. We will never again fear destruction. We will build something history cannot erase. We will become unforgettable." Would people not follow? Of course they would. Humans love certainty, especially after suffering. Humans love leaders who make fear feel manageable. And perhaps Babel felt hopeful at first. Workers building together, families thriving, innovation flourishing, the energy of shared purpose electrifying civilization. There is something intoxicating about participating in something larger than yourself. To feel history unfolding beneath your hands, to believe your life matters because it contributes to greatness. Babel probably felt inspiring, until inspiration slowly became pride, because pride rarely arrives announcing itself. Pride disguises itself as confidence, wisdom, progress, necessity. Soon the dream changes. Not, "Can we build?" but, "Look what we have built." Not, "We are fortunate," but, "We are exceptional." Not, "We are vulnerable," but, "We are unstoppable." And history trembles whenever civilizations begin believing themselves unstoppable. Egypt believed it. Babylon believed it. Rome believed it. Empires rise. Empires flourish. Empires assume permanence. Then history humbles them. Always. Babel reveals something terrifying about human psychology. People united around shared fear, eventually transformed fear into pride. Their insecurity produced overconfidence. Their trauma produced domination. Their desire for safety slowly became rebellion against limitation itself. And perhaps this is why the tower matters, because Babel was never ultimately about architecture. It was about orientation. Would humanity remain humble? Or would humanity slowly begin believing itself sufficient? Would humans trust dependence? Or worship self-made greatness? And maybe this feels uncomfortably familiar, because modern humanity stands inside its own Babel moment. We create technologies that previous generations would call miracles. We reshape biology. We alter communication. We dream of colonizing planets. We increasingly believe problems can always be solved if intelligence grows powerful enough. And perhaps we quietly ask the same question Babel once asked. Do we still need limits? Do we still need humility? Do we still need anything beyond ourselves? The tower rose, brick by brick, dream by dream. Humanity united beneath one vision. One people, one language, one name. It must have felt unstoppable. But every civilization eventually reaches a dangerous threshold. The moment success becomes arrogance. The moment confidence becomes blindness. The moment humans forget they are still fragile creatures standing beneath a sky far larger than themselves. And somewhere beyond the growing city, something was watching. Because while humanity stared upward at its tower, heaven had already begun looking down. And the dream of Babel was about to meet its limit. The most dangerous collapses in history rarely begin with explosions. They begin with misunderstanding. A sentence no longer understood. Trust quietly breaking. People looking at one another and suddenly realizing they are no longer speaking the same language. Not only with words, but with values, with vision, with identity. And perhaps this is what makes Babel so unsettling. Because the tower did not collapse first, human connection did. Imagine the city at its height, brick upon brick rising toward impossible skies. Workers shouting instructions, merchants moving through crowded roads, families dreaming of futures larger than fear, children growing up believing they belong to the greatest civilization humanity had ever known. For the first time since the flood, humanity felt united. One people, one language, one dream. No divisions, no borders, no tribal fragmentation. And perhaps, for a moment, it truly felt unstoppable. The builders had every reason to believe history was finally bending in their favor. The city expanded, trade increased, knowledge accumulated, technology advanced. The tower climbed higher, every day becoming proof of human capability. And with every stone placed, a subtle psychological transformation occurred. The impossible no longer felt impossible. The extraordinary became normal. Success slowly erased caution, because success always changes the human mind. At first, people celebrate survival. Then they celebrate progress. Then they begin expecting greatness. And eventually, they stop imagining failure altogether. This is where civilizations become vulnerable, not in weakness, but in confidence. The people of Babel had stopped fearing limits. Why should they? Everything seemed to be working. Human effort was producing visible results. Cooperation was succeeding. The city stood. The tower rose. The future looked secure. What danger could possibly threaten a civilization this united? And perhaps that question itself was the danger, because history whispers something uncomfortable. The moment humans begin believing they are untouchable, collapse quietly begins. The ancient text suddenly shifts perspective. For the first time in the story, we move away from humanity's ambition, away from human confidence, away from the city below, and upward, to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord came down. Pause there. The irony is impossible to ignore. Humanity believed it was reaching heaven, yet heaven still had to come down to see it. The tower felt enormous. To humans, massive, unstoppable. But from a divine perspective, small, limited, almost childlike. And hidden inside this irony lies something profound. Human arrogance often exaggerates its own greatness. Humans mistake progress for transcendence, power for wisdom, scale for significance. But perspective changes everything. What feels monumental to one generation often becomes forgotten rubble to another. Every empire believes itself eternal, until time proves otherwise. The Lord observes the city, the unity, the ambition, and says something deeply revealing. If, as one people speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. This sentence has confused readers for centuries. Was God threatened? Afraid of human achievement? Fearful of progress? Perhaps not. Perhaps the deeper issue was not capability, but direction. Human power without humility becomes dangerous. Intelligence without wisdom becomes destructive. Unity without moral grounding becomes control. The problem was never cooperation itself. The problem was what humanity was becoming through cooperation. Because people united around fear and pride become frighteningly powerful. History proves this endlessly. Nations united under dangerous ideologies. Mass movements fueled by certainty. Entire civilizations convinced they were morally untouchable. Humanity's greatest horrors rarely emerge from division alone. Sometimes, they emerge from unity around the wrong dream. Babel was not merely organized. It was spiritually misaligned. The city was becoming centered around self-glorification. Let us make a name for ourselves. Not gratitude, not humility, not stewardship. Identity rooted in greatness, and greatness without humility eventually becomes idolatry. Humanity had not simply built upward. Humanity had begun worshiping itself. And perhaps this feels painfully modern, because modern civilization often sounds strangely Babel-like. We celebrate limitless growth, limitless technology, limitless expansion. We increasingly trust intelligence over wisdom, capability over character, speed over reflection. And quietly, subtly, humanity still whispers, Nothing will be impossible for us, but every age eventually faces the same question. Just because humans can, does that mean humans should? So heaven responds, not with fire, not with flood, not with annihilation. Something stranger, something quieter. Language. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other. At first glance, this feels harsh, even unnecessary. Why divide people? Why disrupt progress? Why fracture unity? But perhaps the deeper question is this. Can unity become dangerous when humans lose humility? Because language is more than words. Language creates identity, trust, shared meaning. Civilization itself depends upon communication. Remove shared understanding, and systems begin breaking. Imagine waking up one ordinary morning in Babel. The sun rises. Workers gather. Builders climb scaffolding. Merchants prepare trade. Everything feels normal. Then suddenly, confusion. A foreman gives instructions. No one understands. Workers argue. Voices rise. Frustration spreads. Simple tasks become impossible. A father speaks to neighbors. They stare back in confusion. Friends stop understanding one another. Markets descend into chaos. Arguments multiply. Fear spreads. The city begins unraveling, not through violence, but through misunderstanding. This is what makes Babel haunting. The collapse happened inside relationships first, because civilizations are held together by trust. And trust requires shared meaning. The moment people stop understanding one another, fear enters, suspicion enters, division grows. History repeats this endlessly. Political division, cultural fragmentation, ideological tribalism, families divided by worldview, nations fractured by competing truths, people using the same words, but meaning entirely different things. We often imagine Babel as ancient history, yet perhaps Babel never truly ended, because humanity still struggles to speak the same language, not grammatically, spiritually, morally, emotionally. We argue constantly, yet rarely understand one another. People shouting louder, while listening less, connected digitally, yet fragmented psychologically. Perhaps the deepest tragedy of Babel was not linguistic diversity itself. Diversity can be beautiful. Different cultures enrich humanity. Different languages create wonder. The tragedy was broken trust, broken understanding, the collapse of shared vision. Because the dream of Babel had depended upon sameness. Once sameness disappeared, fear returned. The builders no longer felt united. The city no longer felt secure. The dream no longer felt inevitable. And once fear returns, blame follows quickly. Imagine the tension, workers accusing one another, leaders losing authority, projects stalling, miscommunication creating anger. The same city once united by ambition, now fractured by confusion. How quickly human cooperation collapses when misunderstanding enters. History has always been fragile this way. Civilizations often appear stable, until suddenly they are not. Rome seemed eternal. Empires seemed invincible. Markets looked unstoppable. Then something shifts. Communication breaks. Trust fractures. Systems collapse. People scatter. The scriptures say, "So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city." There it is, the sentence humanity feared most. Scattered. The very thing Babel tried desperately to prevent. The irony is devastating. In trying to control vulnerability, humanity created the conditions for its own division. In trying to prevent scattering, they accelerated it. Because fear-driven control often creates the outcome it fears most. The more people grasp tightly, the more life slips through their hands. Relationships collapse this way. Parents, controlling children too tightly, often push them away. Leaders obsessed with power lose trust. Societies demanding conformity breed rebellion. Human beings cannot force unity forever. Something eventually fractures, and Babel fractured completely. Families moved apart. Communities spread outward. Languages diversified. Cultures formed. Nations emerged. Humanity scattered across the earth. At first, it probably felt tragic. The death of a dream. The end of certainty. The collapse of shared identity. But perhaps something unexpected emerged from division. Humility. Because limits matter. Diversity matters. Dependence matters. Human beings were never designed to centralize ultimate power inside themselves. The Babel story reminds us. Humanity flourishes when ambition is balanced by humility. Progress guided by wisdom. Power restrained by responsibility. The tower stood unfinished, a monument to human overreach. A reminder that civilization built only upon pride eventually cracks. And somewhere inside broken Babel, perhaps Nimrod watched his dream collapse. The ruler who had promised greatness. The visionary who imagined unity. The builder of impossible things. Now, standing in confusion, watching language fracture his empire, watching certainty dissolve, watching humanity scatter into history. Did he feel anger, grief, disbelief? Did he blame heaven? Or did he finally understand? We are not told. The silence feels intentional. Because perhaps Nimrod matters less than the warning he leaves behind. Every generation builds Babel. Every age believes itself wiser than the last. Every civilization imagines permanence. Every empire whispers, "We are different. We are stronger. We have overcome limits." And every generation eventually learns the same truth. Human greatness without humility cannot hold forever. The city collapsed. The dream shattered. The people scattered. But something unsettling remained. The desire, the ancient hunger, the longing to rise higher, build greater, become untouchable. Humanity lost the tower, but it never lost the temptation. And perhaps that temptation still lives among us now. History has a strange habit of simplifying complicated people. Heroes become flawless. Villains become monsters. Empires rewrite memory. Stories sharpen into certainty. And somewhere between admiration and fear, truth quietly disappears. Perhaps no biblical figure suffers from this problem more than Nimrod, depending on who tells the story. He is either a mighty ruler who helped humanity rebuild civilization, or the first tyrant in human memory, a visionary, a rebel, a king, a hunter, a builder, a warning. The difficulty begins with something frustratingly simple. We know almost nothing about him. The Bible gives only fragments, a handful of lines, no speeches, no personal struggles, no inner thoughts, no dramatic fall, just traces, shadows. Enough mystery for generations to argue. And argue they have, because Nimrod sits at the crossroads of one of humanity's oldest debates. When does strong leadership become dangerous? At what point does order quietly transform into control? And perhaps most uncomfortable of all, how do we tell the difference between a visionary and a tyrant? Let us begin with the generous interpretation. Imagine the world Nimrod inherited. Humanity had barely survived catastrophe. The flood remained a collective wound. Civilization was fragile. Fear lingered everywhere. Scattered families struggled against wilderness. Chaos still felt frighteningly possible. What does a broken civilization need after trauma? Leadership, direction, organization, stability. Perhaps Nimrod simply saw what others could not. Perhaps he looked at scattered humanity and understood something important. Without unity, survival becomes fragile. Without systems, people suffer. Without vision, fear consumes civilization. Maybe Nimrod was not driven by arrogance at first. Maybe he was driven by compassion. Imagine him gathering people together, teaching cooperation, building roads, strengthening cities, creating food systems, protecting vulnerable communities. A mighty hunter, after all, might have meant protector. Someone standing between civilization and danger. Someone capable enough to inspire confidence. Perhaps Nimrod was exactly what humanity needed. After all, every civilization owes something to builders. Without builders, there are no cities, no law, no infrastructure, no stability, no progress. Someone must imagine a future before others can live inside it. And history tends to remember such people harshly. Strong leaders often appear threatening in hindsight, especially when later generations grow suspicious of centralized power. Maybe Nimrod became a victim of theological memory. Maybe later traditions exaggerated his rebellion. Maybe Babel was not initially pride, but practical wisdom. One city, one language, one civilization. A way to avoid fragmentation and violence. From this perspective, Nimrod looks less like a tyrant and more like humanity's first great statesman. A man attempting something impossible, preventing chaos before it returned. A survivor refusing to let civilization collapse again. And if that were the whole story, perhaps Nimrod deserves admiration. But history rarely stays that simple, because strong leadership always carries temptation. And here begins the darker interpretation. The ancient Jewish historian Flavius Josephus described Nimrod very differently. According to Josephus, Nimrod encouraged humanity to trust human strength rather than God. He persuaded people that dependence was weakness. He inspired rebellion. The tower itself became an act of defiance, a refusal ever to remain vulnerable again. Josephus even imagined Nimrod speaking something like this. Never again trust heaven. Never again depend upon forces outside human control. Build high enough that disaster cannot touch you. Whether historically accurate or not, the psychology feels disturbingly familiar, because tyrants rarely rise through fear alone. They rise through wounded hope. They emerge after crisis, after war, after collapse, after humiliation. People exhausted by uncertainty naturally hunger for certainty, and certainty often arrives wearing confidence. History repeats the pattern endlessly. A broken people say, "We need safety." A strong leader says, "He can provide it." A fearful society says, "We need unity." The leader says, "Then trust me." Slowly, power expands. Questions disappear. Criticism weakens. Fear becomes loyalty. Loyalty becomes dependency. And eventually, the leader no longer serves the people. The people serve the leader's vision. This is the danger hidden inside greatness, because leadership itself is not evil. Strong leadership can heal nations, but concentrated power quietly changes people. Psychologists call this the intoxication of power. Power alters perception. Successful leaders begin trusting themselves more than anyone else. Criticism feels threatening. Limits feel unnecessary. Humility becomes inconvenient. After enough victories, a dangerous thought emerges. Perhaps I truly know better. Perhaps rules no longer apply to me. Perhaps history itself depends upon my greatness. And perhaps Nimrod reached this threshold. Imagine watching cities rise because of your leadership. Watching thousands follow your direction. Watching civilization strengthen beneath your vision. Would it not feel validating? Would you not begin believing your judgment mattered more than others? Power rarely corrupts overnight. It grows slowly, quietly. almost invisibly. One compromise, one expansion, one justified decision after another, until eventually, control feels necessary, and necessity becomes justification for almost anything. Could Babel itself reveal this transformation? Let us ask an uncomfortable question. Why build one city? Why insist upon one center? Why fear scattering so intensely? Perhaps because centralized power benefits rulers. One people, one language, one system. Easy to organize, easy to govern, easy to influence. History shows us repeatedly, empires prefer unity. Diversity complicates control. Local identity weakens central authority. Independent thought threatens uniform systems. Could Nimrod's dream of unity have hidden something darker? The desire to consolidate power, the desire to create a civilization dependent upon centralized authority. The tower itself becomes symbolic here. Not merely architecture, hierarchy. A visible reminder of who stood at the center, who led, who ruled, who shaped meaning itself. And perhaps this explains why Nimrod unsettles modern readers, because he feels strangely familiar. History never stopped producing Nimrods. Some wore crowns, some wore military uniforms, some wore suits, some carried ideologies, some promised greatness, some promised safety, some promised national rebirth. All spoke a version of the same message. Trust me, follow me. Together we will become unstoppable. And humans often listen, because fear loves confidence, especially after suffering. But perhaps the deepest controversy surrounding Nimrod is not historical. It is psychological. Was he evil or simply human? Because villains in real life rarely see themselves as villains. Most dangerous leaders believe they are helping, protecting, saving, improving civilization. Very few wake up thinking, today I will become a tyrant. Instead, control often disguises itself as responsibility. Ambition disguises itself as necessity. Pride disguises itself as vision. And perhaps Nimrod genuinely believed Babel was good. Perhaps he believed humanity needed protection, needed unity, needed greatness. Perhaps he feared vulnerability after the flood just as everyone else did. Maybe Babel was born from fear, before becoming pride. If so, Nimrod becomes tragically human, not a monster, not a demon, a wounded leader overreaching, a visionary unable to recognize the limits of power. And perhaps this possibility feels more unsettling than simple evil. Because if Nimrod were only wicked, the lesson stays safely distant. But if Nimrod was complicated, human, well-intentioned at first, then the story becomes uncomfortable. Because it means dangerous systems are often built by people trying to solve real problems. History proves this repeatedly. Empires often begin with noble goals: security, prosperity, order, justice. Yet, slowly, without humility, control expands, freedom contracts, pride grows, and the line between protector and oppressor quietly disappears. Maybe this explains why Babel matters so much. The issue was never simply bricks, or architecture, or ambition itself. The issue was orientation. Who stands at the center? Human greatness, or humility before something greater. This tension remains painfully modern. Today we celebrate innovation, technology, global systems, human capability, and rightly so. Human achievement is extraordinary, but Nimrod's story whispers caution. Capability without wisdom becomes dangerous. Progress without humility becomes reckless. Unity without moral grounding becomes fragile. And perhaps modern civilization faces the same temptation Babel once faced. The temptation to believe we no longer need limits. We no longer need humility. We can solve everything ourselves. We can engineer permanence. We can become untouchable. Artificial intelligence, biotechnology, surveillance systems, global power structures. None of these are evil by themselves. Neither was Babel's technology. The question is always deeper. Who are we becoming while building them? Because every civilization eventually reveals its true God. Some worship wealth, some power, some ideology, some identity. Babel may simply have worshipped humanity itself, and Nimrod. Perhaps he became the priest of that belief. Or perhaps he was only a leader trapped inside forces larger than himself. A man trying to save civilization, who accidentally helped create something dangerous. We may never know. The historical evidence is too thin. The ancient texts too fragmented. The mystery too deep. And perhaps the ambiguity itself is intentional, because Nimrod functions less like a biography and more like a mirror. The real question is not, was Nimrod a tyrant? The real question is, would we recognize one if we lived under him? Would we follow him? Would we admire him? Would we call him visionary while overlooking warning signs? More disturbingly, could parts of Nimrod exist inside all of us? The hunger to control, to be remembered, to build something so significant that vulnerability disappears. The temptation to believe our wisdom alone is enough, because Babel was not built by one man. Humanity helped raise every brick, and perhaps that is the darkest truth of all. Tyrants rarely rise alone. Civilizations participate in their creation. The crowd empowers what it secretly desires. Safety, greatness, certainty, meaning. Nimrod may have led, but humanity followed willingly. And somewhere inside the ruins of Babel, the question still echoes: visionary leader or first tyrant? Perhaps history never fully answered, because every generation must answer it again for itself. What would happen if Nimrod were born in our world? Not ancient Mesopotamia, not beneath unfinished towers of baked brick, but here, now, in the age of satellites, artificial intelligence, social media, mass surveillance, global corporations. What kind of man would he become? Would he wear armor, carry weapons, rule from a throne? Probably not, because power evolves. Every age creates leaders in its own image. Ancient civilizations admired conquerors. Industrial societies admired builders. Modern civilization worships influence, technology, scale, reach, control over systems rather than territories. If Nimrod lived today, he might never carry a sword. He might carry ideas, algorithms, networks, vision, because modern empires are rarely built from stone. They are built from information, attention, dependency, data. The first thing to understand is this: Nimrod would almost certainly thrive in times of uncertainty, because history teaches us something predictable. Periods of confusion create openings for ambitious leaders. Economic instability, political division, climate anxiety, technological disruption, cultural fragmentation, fear. Fear has always prepared the stage for powerful personalities. And our age is full of fear. Fear of irrelevance, fear of being replaced, fear of chaos, fear of misinformation, fear of economic collapse, fear of loneliness, fear of meaninglessness. In other words, the modern world looks strangely ready for someone offering certainty. Imagine him appearing confident, calm, charismatic, brilliant, not promising domination at first. No, the smartest leaders rarely begin that way. He would promise solutions, efficiency, connection, progress, security. Perhaps he would say, "The world is too divided. Humanity is wasting its potential. We need unity. We need shared systems. We need something bigger than tribal conflict. And honestly, many people would agree, because who does not want less division, less chaos, more stability? This is what makes Nimrod dangerous or compelling, depending on perspective. The appeal would feel reasonable. Maybe he begins in technology, a visionary entrepreneur, someone obsessed with solving human problems. He builds communication systems connecting billions, creates platforms removing barriers between nations, develops tools capable of ending poverty, inefficiency, confusion. At first, the world celebrates him. Of course it would. Humans love builders, especially builders promising hope. People would call him revolutionary, a genius, a once-in-a-generation visionary. Governments seek his advice. Universities praise his innovation. Media follows his every word. Followers multiply, because people naturally gather around confidence, especially confidence that seems capable of reshaping reality. And perhaps this version of Nimrod begins sincerely. Maybe he genuinely wants progress, human flourishing, a safer civilization. Maybe he truly believes technology can save humanity from itself. But history warns us. Success changes leaders. Power changes psychology. Influence alters identity. The more people admire you, the easier it becomes to trust yourself too much. The more systems depend on you, the harder it becomes accepting limits. Soon the language subtly changes. Not, we are helping people, but we are transforming humanity. Not, we created useful tools, but we are redesigning civilization itself. And here, the modern Babel begins rising, not through bricks, through networks, through infrastructure, through centralized systems, because if Nimrod lived today, he would almost certainly think globally. Ancient Babel sought one language, one people, one system. Modern Nimrod would likely dream similarly. Universal connection, global cooperation, one technological framework linking humanity together. Again, this does not sound evil. In many ways, it sounds beautiful. A world less divided, more connected, less tribal, more cooperative. Yet history whispers a warning. Unity always depends upon what sits at the center. Who defines truth? Who controls systems? Who decides values? Who determines limits? And here lies one of the deepest modern controversies. Technology increasingly centralizes power. A few corporations shape communication. A few algorithms shape attention. A few institutions shape information. The modern world already resembles Babel more than many realize. One digital language. One interconnected civilization. One increasingly shared culture. One invisible tower made of data. And perhaps Nimrod would stand near its center. Not as emperor. No. Modern people distrust obvious rulers. He would appear as innovator, problem solver, visionary, a builder of systems too useful to reject. And maybe people would voluntarily surrender dependence, because modern control rarely arrives through force. It arrives through convenience. We willingly give attention, privacy, freedom, decision-making, because systems feel easier, safer, smarter. Imagine Nimrod speaking about artificial intelligence. Perhaps he says, human limitation is the problem. I can help us transcend weakness, solve conflict, predict crises, eliminate inefficiency, protect civilization from collapse. Again, the argument sounds persuasive because AI genuinely contains extraordinary potential. Medicine, education, scientific advancement, crisis prediction. human flourishing. But Babel always asks a deeper question. Who controls the tower? What happens when capability outpaces wisdom? When intelligence grows faster than morality? When humans become powerful enough to reshape reality, yet emotionally remain fragile? This may be Babel's deepest warning. Technology grows exponentially. Human character rarely does. Or tools evolve faster than our wisdom. The builders of Babel were technologically innovative for their age. Brickmaking represented advancement. Engineering represented capability. Nothing inherently evil existed in the tools themselves. The problem emerged through orientation, pride, control, the illusion of self-sufficiency. Modern civilization risks the same temptation. The belief we can solve mortality. We can engineer perfection. We can eliminate suffering. We can redesign humanity. We no longer need dependence. We no longer need humility. We no longer need mystery. Only progress. Only intelligence. Only scale. This is where Nimrod becomes hauntingly modern. Because perhaps he would not oppose morality directly. Perhaps he simply makes humanity feel increasingly self-sufficient. Depend less on transcendence. Depend more on systems. Depend less on wisdom traditions. Depend more on optimization. Depend less on humility. Depend more on capability. Would people resist? Honestly, probably not at first. History shows humans willingly follow visions promising greatness, especially after instability, and our world feels unstable. Political polarization, environmental anxiety, loneliness, epidemics, economic uncertainty, rapid technological disruption. Fear again fills civilization. Fear always creates hunger for certainty. Perhaps Nimrod today says, humanity has outgrown old limitations. We need centralized intelligence, unified systems, a shared global future. And millions listen, perhaps billions. Because fragmentation exhausts people. Division feels unbearable. Unity sounds hopeful. But Babel always asks the same dangerous question. Unity around what? Power for whom? Progress toward what purpose? Because every civilization eventually reveals its true values. And if Nimrod lived today, would he become tyrant? Not necessarily. That is what makes the question difficult. Maybe he genuinely helps humanity. Maybe he reduces suffering. Maybe he creates stability. Maybe he inspires cooperation. History is complicated. The danger is not ambition itself. The danger is ambition without accountability, capability without humility, progress without wisdom, power without limits. Would Nimrod embrace surveillance? Would he justify monitoring people for safety? Perhaps. History shows leaders often sacrifice privacy in exchange for security. Would he centralize information? Likely. Would he use algorithms to shape human behavior? Maybe even believing it helps society. Would he seek influence across nations? Almost certainly, because Babel was always global in imagination. But here lies the uncomfortable truth. Modern humanity might celebrate Nimrod, at least initially. We admire confidence, scale, innovation, disruption. We reward people who think impossibly large. People who dream beyond limits. Modern culture often worships builders, and perhaps rightly. Builders matter, but Babel reminds us, builders without humility become dangerous, even unintentionally. The greatest danger is not malicious genius. It is sincere overconfidence, the belief in know what is best. I understand humanity. Can guide civilization safely. History trembles whenever leaders begin believing themselves indispensable. Because no human being handles unchecked power perfectly. Not kings, not politicians, not billionaires, not visionaries, not us. And perhaps the deepest question is not, would Nimrod build Babel today? Perhaps the question is, have we already started building it ourselves? Every social platform seeking total attention, every technology promising transcendence, every system centralizing influence, every human longing to overcome vulnerability through progress. Brick by brick, code by code, network by network, the tower rises, invisible now, digital, psychological, global, and somewhere inside modern civilization, the old temptation still whispers, build higher, become greater, eliminate weakness, control uncertainty, become unstoppable. But Babel's warning has never changed. Human greatness without humility eventually fractures, not because progress is evil, but because humans remain human, fragile, proud, fearful, limited. And perhaps, if Nimrod lived today, he would not force us to build Babel. He would simply persuade us that we already wanted it. Every civilization leaves behind a warning. Not only monuments, not only ruins, warnings. Egypt left pyramids. Rome left roads. Empires leave architecture behind. But history leaves patterns. And perhaps the story of Nimrod survives not because of certainty, but because of caution. Because somewhere inside the rise and collapse of Babel lives a question every generation must answer. What happens when greatness grows faster than wisdom? At first glance, Nimrod's dream sounds admirable. Build civilization, protect people, unite humanity, prevent chaos, leave behind something lasting. Who among us does not understand that desire? Every human being wants meaning, security, significance. We want our lives to matter. We want suffering to mean something. We want to build futures stronger than our fears. The desire itself is not evil. This is important. Ambition is not evil. Leadership is not evil. Innovation is not evil. Success is not evil. Civilization itself depends upon people brave enough to imagine something larger than survival. Without dreamers, humanity stagnates. Without builders, communities collapse. Without vision, fear wins. The problem was never that Nimrod dreamed. The problem was what the dream slowly became. Because somewhere along the way, the dream stopped being about stewardship and became about identity. Let us make a name for ourselves. Those words matter, not because legacy is wrong, but because identity built entirely upon greatness becomes fragile. When people need success to feel worthy, pride quietly enters. When leaders need admiration to feel secure, control quietly grows. When civilizations define themselves through superiority, collapse quietly begins. Because pride always overpromises. Pride whispers, "You are stronger than limits." You no longer need caution. You no longer need humility. You no longer need accountability. You are exceptional. History repeatedly proves what happens next. The powerful stop listening. Criticism becomes threatening. Weakness becomes unacceptable. Vulnerability feels dangerous. Soon, the very thing that created greatness begins destroying it. This is one of history's cruelest ironies. Strength often plants the seeds of weakness. Success often breeds failure. Victory often produces blindness. Why? Because humans struggle to carry power without becoming shaped by it. Power changes perspective. The higher people rise, the easier it becomes, forgetting fragility. Kings forget mortality. Empires forget collapse. Innovators forget consequences. Leaders forget dependence. And ordinary people. We do this too. Success in business, recognition, wealth, influence, knowledge, even moral certainty. Anything can become Babel if it slowly convinces us. No longer need humility. And perhaps this is why Nimrod still matters. Because Babel was never only ancient history. Babel lives inside the human condition. Every person builds towers. Some build careers. Some build reputations. Some build influence. Some build identities. Some build intellectual superiority. Some build control over relationships. Some build walls around vulnerability. Brick by brick, humans try to construct permanence. We fear weakness. We fear uncertainty. We fear dependence. And so we build larger dreams, larger systems, larger identities, always hoping achievement might finally quiet insecurity. But insecurity cannot be solved through height. The tower never reaches high enough. That is Babel's tragedy. No matter how much humans build, fear eventually returns. Because greatness without humility cannot satisfy the deeper hunger of the soul. You can build success and still feel empty. You can build influence and still fear irrelevance. You can build power and still fear losing control. This is why Babel never truly solved humanity's problem. It only distracted humanity from it. Perhaps this is what humility actually means. Not weakness, not passivity. Humility does not mean thinking small. Humility means remembering proportion. Remembering that power has limits. Knowledge has limits. Control has limits. Human beings remain fragile. No matter how sophisticated civilization becomes, the most dangerous leaders in history were rarely the weakest. Often, they were the most gifted, brilliant strategists, visionary builders, charismatic unifiers, people genuinely capable of changing the world. But capability without humility becomes dangerous, because eventually gifted people begin trusting themselves too completely. History offers endless examples. Empires expanding too far. Leaders refusing correction. Nations believing themselves untouchable. Technologies developed faster than ethics. Every generation believes, we are finally different. We are finally wiser. We are finally beyond collapse. And every generation eventually discovers the same uncomfortable truth. Humans remain human. Still vulnerable to pride, still vulnerable to fear, still vulnerable to self-deception. Perhaps this is Babel's deepest warning. The danger is not intelligence. The danger is forgetting wisdom. The danger is not progress. The danger is progress without moral depth. The danger is not unity. The danger is unity built upon fear, ego, or superiority. And maybe this feels painfully modern, because today humanity builds towers unlike anything previous generations imagined. Artificial intelligence, biotechnology, global networks, digital systems shaping billions of lives. Again, none of these are inherently evil. The question is always deeper. Who are we becoming while building them? More compassionate, more arrogant, more wise, or merely more capable, more connected, more dependent upon systems we barely understand. Modern civilization stands strangely close to Babel. Not because of architecture, but because of psychology. We increasingly believe problems can always be solved through enough intelligence, enough innovation, enough control, enough optimization. But wisdom asks harder questions. Should we? At what cost? Who benefits? What happens if power becomes concentrated? What happens if humanity grows stronger without growing kinder? These questions matter because the future is not shaped only by what humans can build. It is shaped by the kind of humans doing the building. And perhaps this is where Nimrod becomes unexpectedly tragic. If he truly wanted to protect civilization, Then Babel may have begun with good intentions, safety, order, unity. But even good intentions become dangerous when humility disappears, because eventually the dream stopped asking, "What serves humanity?" and began asking, "What glorifies us?" This shift happens quietly, in companies, governments, relationships, families, even spiritual communities. We begin with love, meaning, purpose, then slowly ego enters. Recognition matters more. Control matters more. Being right matters more. And before we realize it, the tower matters more than the people. History leaves us this uncomfortable challenge. Build, dream, create, lead, innovate. But never forget your limits. Never confuse capability with wisdom. Never mistake confidence for truth. Never believe success makes you untouchable. And perhaps most importantly, never build something so large that you forget why you started building in the first place. Because the most dangerous towers are not always physical. Sometimes they exist inside the human heart. The tower of pride, the tower of ego, the tower of certainty, the tower of self-sufficiency. And every person eventually faces the same choice. Will success make you humble? Marcher. The story of Nimrod ends in mystery. No dramatic ending, no final speech, no clear resolution, only ruins, questions, a scattered humanity. And perhaps that silence itself teaches something profound. Eventually, every tower falls, every empire fades, every reputation weakens, every civilization changes. But character, humility, wisdom, these survive longer than monuments, because greatness built upon pride collapses. But greatness rooted in humility can endure. And perhaps that is the final lesson Babel leaves behind. The problem was never humanity reaching upward. The problem was humanity forgetting to look downward, to remember its own fragility. Dust still trying to become heaven, fear still disguised as ambition, humans still searching for meaning, still building, still dreaming, still reaching. The question has never been whether humanity should build great things. The real question is this: what kind of people will we become while building them? Because somewhere, in every generation, the tower quietly rises again, and so does the choice.